To kick off the second hour of the show, we're pleased to be joined by Oakland County Prosecutor Karen McDonald with us now on the program. Karen, thanks for being with us today.
Good morning.
Good morning. Glad to have you on. Let's start off by talking about a case that's becoming more important to your office as of late. That's the case of Juwan Deering. Now, in April of 2000, 5 children died in a house fire in Royal Oak Township, and then 6 years later, Mr. Deering was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, and that sentence was, and that conviction was largely based on the testimony of 3 jailhouse informants. However, over the years, it's been found not only by your office, but by others that have contacted your office about this case, that some of those informant testimonies were not quite legitimate or had some faults to them. Care to discuss a little bit about why this case is being reconsidered and where it's at right now?
Sure. It came to my attention because the Innocence Clinic asked us to take a look at it solely regarding the arson science. As many of the listeners may know, the arson science has changed over the past 20, 30 years, and what we traditionally relied on is no longer credible. So in the process of doing that, a couple prosecutors who are career prosecutors that have been in the office for a very long time came to see me and said, we actually have some concerns about this case, and we always have. So I just pulled the file, the actual file, which consists of 3 or 4 boxes of documents, and immediately saw a letter written by one of the informants to the prosecutor at the time, indicating that there was some sort of agreement about a deal he would get for testifying. And that, of course, is alarming because jailhouse informants are used and they're allowable. You just have to always disclose to the jury what, if anything, they received for their cooperation and their testimony. And I quickly realized that none of that was ever even disclosed or brought up in the trial. I immediately called the Innocence Clinic and said, do you know about this letter? And that led to a long investigation, which started with me ordering all of our files that we had charged any of those 3 informants to see if there were other deals. It's really important here to understand the only way anybody would discover that these informants were given deals or leniency for their cooperation and testimony is by looking at the private confidential files of the prosecutor, notes that we as trial lawyers write in the folder, internal memos. And it was clear to me that had taken place. In fact, in one case, the informant had been used for over 20 years with the Sheriff's Department. So I requested and was granted permission to hire an independent prosecutor, was completely transparent, and turned it all over to the Mr. Deering's lawyers as well as the public. And the Michigan State Police aided in doing an independent investigation. The independent prosecutor, Beth Morrow, just released her recommendation, which was that we vacate Mr. Deering's conviction. And based on all of the findings, I agree with that, based on everything that was discovered.
We're joined by Karen McDonald. She is the Oakland County Prosecutor with us on the Megacast. And Prosecutor, when information like was received in Mr. Deering's case is brought to the prosecutor's office's attention or to some other higher office's attention, where does that process start to then review that case? Is it a situation where you're immediately starting with, okay, maybe we need to reconsider this person's conviction, or maybe we want to vacate their sentence? Where does that process generally start for people that may have cases that have some questionable outcomes or questionable evidence or questionable processes, and how do they go about addressing that with their prosecutor, such as your office?
Well, there's 2 lines here. The first route is the traditional route of your appeals court. You have a right to appeal in the Michigan Court of Appeals, and then if the Michigan Supreme Court grants leave, then they will hear your case. The other is through what we call a conviction integrity unit. And these are units designated in prosecutor's office solely to revisit cases where new information and evidence has come to light. It is not to stand in the place of the jury. It is to address cases where, for instance, that the science used 20 years ago has now been improved, or DNA evidence has come to light, or new evidence that the jury didn't hear. I mean, that is in the works. I've requested that from the Board of Commissioners, and the County Executive, Dave Coulter, actually incorporated that in his budget proposal. So we hope to be up and running on that in October. However, this is a little different because this involves misconduct, and it's not just finding out new information. It's discovering that there was prosecutorial misconduct, and as well as we later discovered that there was a second part of an interview done of the only living child from the fire just days after the fire that was never turned over to even our office, which included a photo ID lineup where the child looked at a picture of Mr. Deering, what we can tell, and said it wasn't him, which is a pretty big deal that our office didn't know about and the defendant didn't know about. So this is a little, I think, exceptional. I think your average conviction integrity unit reviews hundreds of cases and only recommends relief granted on few of them. And that can come to our unit through an attorney, but also straight from an individual who's been convicted and is incarcerated.
We're joined by Karen McDonald, the Oakland County Prosecutor, with us on the Megacast today. And Prosecutor McDonald, shifting gears a little bit, we've heard a lot recently about, there's been a lot of debate recently, especially since the Michigan marijuana laws were changed and that marijuana was decriminalized in the state of Michigan, although it's still federally illegal. That should be of note. There's been a lot of discussion about reconsidering some cases of those that have been imprisoned or convicted of marijuana charges. And locally, on September 1st, Rudy Gamo's case, his attorneys had gathered to call for an immediate release and dropping of all charges against him related to marijuana-related charges that were against him. Your office had even said that you believe that the prison time that he has served already more than fits his crime, and the defendant's notes says in his brief that the conduct for which the defendant was incarcerated has been decriminalized, and because of that, his case should be reconsidered. From your office's perspective, now that Michigan has decriminalized marijuana, both the sale and possession of marijuana, with some other stipulations in place, what is your office doing, or what's your office's approach to considering some of these people that are in prison as a result of cases here in Oakland County to either maybe reconsider their charges or reconsider their convictions, or maybe vacate sentences because we now have a different paradigm in the state of Michigan regarding marijuana?
We do, and we also have a new prosecutor. And, I ran on a platform of common sense criminal justice reform, which is that our first priority is public safety, but we need to do what works and what makes sense and what protects all people. And keeping somebody in prison for an offense that is no longer considered illegal at a great expense to the taxpayer doesn't make sense if so long as this person doesn't pose a threat to the public. In Mr. Gamo's case, it was brought to us. We reviewed it. I reviewed it personally, and we agreed. We stipulated that it should be that he should be released. However, in a rare turn of events, the judge did not agree, which is somewhat unusual because when you have a prosecutor who agrees and a defendant who agrees, I'm actually a former circuit court judge, and that's pretty much a home run. But in this case, the judge did not agree, and I can't speak for the judge.
We're joined by Oakland County Prosecutor Karen McDonald on the Megacast. Karen's in her first term as the prosecutor here in Oakland County, and Prosecutor McDonald, over the past year and a half, especially given the protests and a lot of the discussions that were initiated in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, as well as hate crimes against people in the Asian American Pacific Islander community in Florida. There's been a lot of discussion and focus across the U.S., but also here in Michigan, on addressing hate crimes, and particularly here in Oakland County, where we have such a wide variety of diverse populations. What is your office, in partnership with other organizations such as the Sheriff's Office, local police departments, and the state police, and other organizations as well, what are you doing to address the issue of hate crimes, not only prevention, but also addressing them in the form of prosecution here in Oakland County?
So we created a hate crimes unit, which is a dedicated prosecutor that reviews those cases from the charging decision and then vertically prosecutes that all the way through the system. As part of that, she has received expert training with the cooperation and help from the Attorney General's office and other agencies and resources. We've also partnered with Fair Michigan that helps us identify and work with and advocate for members of the LGBTQ community. And also doing outreach to local law enforcement agencies to really educate law enforcement on what's a hate crime, what can we prosecute, what do we need to prosecute it. A lot of these things occur and they don't show up as hate crimes because that's not really a word that is a typical law enforcement word. But it could be, any kind of assault of crime. It could be property destruction. So, to be very candid, those cases aren't easy to prosecute, and I'm hoping that the Michigan legislature will take a look at those statutes to make it a little easier to prosecute when we know that it was out of somebody's prejudice against somebody's ethnicity or background, but they aren't easy to prosecute. So it takes some specialized training, both with the prosecutor's office and local law enforcement agencies.
We're joined by Oakland County Prosecutor Karen McDonald with us on the Megacast today. And Prosecutor McDonald, in your previous position as an assistant prosecutor for 5 years, you long were an advocate for children, particularly those in prosecuting children who were victims, prosecuting the perpetrators of child sex crimes here in Oakland County. What's being done at the prosecutor level today to continue to battle against that issue here in Oakland County, but also the ongoing and continuously growing issue of human trafficking, not only in the state of Michigan, but throughout the U.S. that definitely affects the Oakland County area as well?
So one of the first things we did in the first 90 days is create a trafficking unit, which was formerly called the drug unit. It now is a trafficking unit, and we have prosecutors in that unit that specialize in prosecuting both the trafficking of narcotics, but also human trafficking, which again really it's critical for those individuals to get specialized training. We have some really good law enforcement agencies in this county that have already done that training and are very adept at investigating and prosecuting human trafficking. Madison Heights was the first agency we partnered with, and I'm really proud of the work the people in my office did and are doing, as well as the police department in Madison Heights. So that is, I know it's the first specialized unit that deals with human trafficking in this office, but I think one of the very, very few in the entire state, if not the country. So with regard to child victims, we have had and still have a special victims unit where we focus solely on prosecuting victims of child sexual assault, sex assault, and domestic violence. And also, what people I think forget about is the prosecutor's office also has a juvenile division, and in that division, we proceed on petitions to remove children or temporary petitions for abuse and neglect, where we can really identify vulnerable kids that have a really increased chance of becoming part of the criminal justice system later. We also prosecute and proceed on juvenile delinquent matters. So I absolutely agree and appreciate you commenting on my lifelong advocacy for children. I started out as a public high school teacher, and then was in the prosecutor's office prosecuting child sexual assault cases, and then was in private practice in family law, where I dealt with kids and families as well, and then sat on the circuit court bench in Oakland County as a family court judge.
Let's continue on the juvenile discussion. We're joined by Prosecutor Karen McDonald with us on the Megacast, Oakland County Prosecutor. And while you were running for office, you did make a point of wanting to address reforming the juvenile delinquent system here in Oakland County, or refocusing on it to make it a system that is more conducive to prevention of crime amongst children and preventing the recidivism of children back into the system after they have gone through whatever the means may be to either properly address whatever crimes they may or may not have committed, and to prevent them from coming back into the system later on. Also reforming certain programs and reimagining certain programs like the Children's Village program here in Oakland County. What has been done since you have entered office by your team at the prosecutor's office to begin to address those issues, and what are some changes that maybe the public maybe isn't aware of or isn't seeing, but are definitely making some changes in the lives of children that are unfortunately in the system in one way or another? Well,
first, I'm happy to announce that I've recently been appointed by the governor to the task force that's newly created, solely focusing on juvenile justice reform. I'm very excited about that. We have resources both in this county and in the state, and grant funding for innovative programming that really addresses the problem. In the juvenile system, charging kids with crimes is necessary at times, there's no question. But we also have to understand that very, very often, those kids are being charged for a wrongful act, but they are also usually victims from some sort of abuse or neglect. And because of that, we can't just treat them like mini adults. What we know from the data is that a child that has been removed from a home, even just for one day, has an increased likelihood by 7 times of encountering homelessness, drug addiction, substance abuse, incarceration, suicide. There's just, so what do we want to prevent? Well, what we want to prevent is kids being vulnerable to any of those things, and also being charged with a crime. And so the abuse and neglect area that the prosecutor's office leads in terms of filing petition, we need to spend more time and focus on that. And traditionally, I think that division has not been as emphasized as it should in the past. And that is a priority to me. Why? Because A, I really care about kids and every person, but B, it's common sense. Don't we want to make our community safer by putting focus and resources into children who we know are very likely going to become victims or charged with crimes as adults? That just makes sense to me as a prosecutor, as a lawyer, as a mom. That's what I think we should be focusing on. So I have spent a lot more time focused on that division and really empowering my assistant prosecutors to explore these more modern approaches to how we view children in the criminal justice system. And that involves treatment court, that involves these crossover cases where we both have a child who's been removed or is in a home where there's a petition filed and is also charged with a crime, and working together to find a solution that doesn't end with this child being detained, or proper resources and programming to address the issues. So it's really stunning to me that more time and energy and focus has not been put on the abuse and neglect docket of those kids who are in those cases, because that is really that's the epitome of going upstream and saying, what's the problem? How can we fix it?
We're joined by McDonald, the Oakland County Prosecutor, with us on the Megacast. And Prosecutor, just another couple minutes with you before we'll say goodbye today. Is there anything else that's currently being addressed by the Prosecutor's Office that we maybe haven't spoken about today, or something that would be interesting or important for our audience to know about the work that's being done by your office at this time?
We've accomplished a great deal in 9 months. I pledged in my campaign to address the racial disparity that exists in our criminal justice system. We have partnered with the University of Michigan so that we can collect data so we know who we're charging and what we're charging them with. I've given discretion for the first time in the county for many, many years to assistant prosecutors who are seasoned trial attorneys to make decisions about what makes sense for their cases and for the victims that they're advocating for. And that is something that hasn't been done before, but is important, because when you're the prosecutor who is dealing with the case and you have all of the information, sometimes the right solution is not always the one that you've traditionally taken. So I've given permission, and I really emphasize this idea of looking at an individual case and doing what makes sense for victims of crime and for the defendant, and looking to an eye of how can we prevent this from happening again. And by that, I mean, when we know we have crimes that were instigated out of a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue, incarcerating for a short period of time and never addressing those issues is very expensive, but also it makes us less safe. So that area of the nonviolent crimes where we really need to address mental health issues, substance abuse issues, I'm really focusing on, because I think that's what the county deserves.
And ultimately, public safety and crime prevention has a number of different roots and a number of different impacts that go into not only preventing those crimes, but addressing them and preventing them from happening again in the future or being exacerbated down the line. So we appreciate your insight, appreciate you giving us some information about your office's approach. Of course, when leadership changes, it's important to understand how that leadership's changed, because approaches change as well, and that impacts our community. So, Prosecutor, we appreciate your time. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.